This video is about the 6 kingdoms of life, and we're going to look at the first half of the 6 kingdoms of life. We're going to look at the Eubacteria, the Archaebacteria, and the Protists. Biologists organize living things into 6 kingdoms or categories. These kingdoms are, I'm going to give you their formal scientific names, which are in Latin, and then I'm going to give you their names in plain English. So these kingdoms are Eubacteria, Archaebacteria, Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. But in plain English, and this might not sound like plain English if you're not familiar with these words yet, but here's the plain English. Eubacteria, Archaebacteria, Protists, Fungi, plants, and animals. Those are the 6 kingdoms of life. Before we talk about what distinguishes each kingdom from the next, we have to make sure we have some vocab down because these are the terms we're going to use to distinguish the different kingdoms from each other. So unicellular versus multicellular. Living things that consist of just one cell are called unicellular. Uni means one. And living things that consist of many cells are called multicellular. Multi means many. On the left we have a bacterium, maybe it's a few bacteria there. In the middle, we have plants. On the right, we have a lion. The image on the left, the bacterium, that's a unicellular organism. Plants and animals are multicellular. They're much bigger. This image on the left is obviously through a microscope. Some organisms reproduce asexually. A has a prefix. It means no or not. So asexual reproduction is not sexual reproduction. It's the opposite of sexual reproduction, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the offspring of organisms that reproduce asexually are identical to the parent. In an asexual reproduction, there is only one parent. So imagine if you could just decide to split yourself in two and make 2 identical copies of yourself. That would be asexual reproduction. And that's what's happening in this image. So this is an image of a prokaryote. I didn't illustrate the cell wall, so you have to imagine that black membrane, imagine that there's also a cell wall surrounding it if we're talking about prokaryotes, because virtually all of them do have a cell wall. But the point here is that this cell is splitting in half. And the 2 daughter cells are going to be identical to the parent and to each other. It's just making copies of itself. And that's asexual reproduction. Some organisms reproduce sexually. And the offspring of organisms that reproduce sexually are genetically distinct from their parents. They're different from their parents. And in sexual reproduction, there are 2 parents. So sexual reproduction is what we're more familiar with. This makes more sense to us. If we look at the image on the right, it's a mom, a dad, and there's their daughter. Their daughter is not identical, obviously, to her father, but she's also not identical to her mother. She has DNA from mom and from dad. And that's true of this kitten down here too. She has DNA, or he has DNA, from mom and dad. And so she's not identical, or he's not identical, to either of their parents. When we're talking about the 6 kingdoms of life, it's also useful to know whether or not an organism is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus nor membrane-bound organelles, whereas eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus and they do have membrane-bound organelles. Some organisms can make their own food, and other organisms cannot. They have to eat organisms that make their own food. Autotrophs make their own food. They take things that are not food and turn them into food. Auto means self, and troph means food or nutrients. So an autotroph is an organism that makes its own food. If we look at the image here, we have the green leaves in the trees, we have the green grass, there are chloroplasts in all that green. And those chloroplasts are making carbohydrates. They're using the energy of sunlight, and they're using that energy to turn water and carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Carbon dioxide is not food. But plants can turn carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are food. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food, and humans are heterotrophs. If I were to stand outside and attempt to use the sun's rays to turn carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, I'd starve to death, because humans can't do that. We can't make our own food the way plants can. There's a difference between preparing your own food and making your own food. We often use the term make our own food to really mean prepare our own food. So this woman's eating a pizza. Somebody cooked that pizza, but they didn't take the things that are in the pizza and turn them into food. They were already food. The tomatoes that were turned into tomato sauce, the dairy products that were turned into cheese, all of the things that are in that pizza were food before it was turned into a pizza. And ultimately, if we followed the food chain back far enough, we'd find an autotroph. Anything that we eat comes from autotrophs because we can't make our own food. Autotrophs are also called producers, and heterotrophs are also called consumers. And producers, the autotrophs, they produce food for themselves as well as the consumers. So at the bottom of a food chain, you always find autotrophs. The autotrophs make food for themselves and for everyone else. And so that's why they're called producers. And everyone else, including humans, are called consumers. We simply consume the food produced or made by other organisms. The first two kingdoms of life are the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria. All Eubacteria and Archaebacteria are prokaryotic. And remember what prokaryotic means. It means no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, and the organism is unicellular. Eubacteria and Archaebacteria have cell walls. There are a few exceptions, but it's a very small number of exceptions. So virtually all Eubacteria and Archaebacteria have cell walls. The image on the left is an image of a bacterium with a cell wall. The brown on the outside is the cell wall, and the black on the inside, that's the cell membrane. Eubacteria and Archaebacteria reproduce through binary fission. They simply split in half. They copy their DNA, and the DNA in this image on the right is in red. So you can see the DNA has been copied, and one strand, it's a double strand because it's DNA, but one strand is moving to the left, another strand is moving to the right. And this cell is simply going to split in half. And you'll have two identical cells. That's binary fission. And that's how virtually all Eubacteria and Archaebacteria reproduce. The other four kingdoms of life are the protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And the protists, fungi, plants, and animals are all eukaryotic. And this means that the cells of these organisms contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. If we look down here, we see universal ancestor. Universal means this is the ancestor of all living things. In this sequence here, this is the sequence in which these different kingdoms appeared on Earth. First we had the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria. We said that prokaryotes are very simple compared to eukaryotes. And so it would make sense they appear the soonest, because in the history of life, in the evolution of living things, complexity has appeared later. So we start with simple organisms, we move toward slightly more complex organisms, and then organisms more complex than that. And so life has increased in complexity. And so it makes sense. We start with the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria, all unicellular prokaryotes. But then protists appeared. And the protists, what was so important about them is they're eukaryotes. So their cells had nuclei, and they were larger, and they had more complex structures. They had more organelles within them. And these organelles were membrane bound, mitochondria, chloroplasts. But most protists were still unicellular, although a few developed multicellularity. From the protists, we get fungi, plants, and animals. Fungi, plants, and animals all evolved from protists. And they're all eukaryotic, just like protists. But fungi, plants, and animals are multicellular. All plants and animals are multicellular, and almost all fungi are multicellular. And I feel like keeping this evolutionary relationship in mind helps you remember some of the traits of the different kingdoms. For instance, Eubacteria and Archaebacteria, well, if you remember that they appeared the earliest in the history of life on Earth, then it's easy to remember that they're the simplest. They're unicellular, they're prokaryotic, meaning they have no nucleus. I think of the protists as sort of a turning point. They're kind of the link between the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria on the one hand, and then the fungi, plants, and animals on the other hand, because they're eukaryotic, but they're still unicellular. And then you have the multicellular eukaryotes and the fungi, plants, and animals. And so let's wrap up with our bullet point here. Almost all protists are unicellular, and almost all fungi are multicellular, but all plants and animals are multicellular. Let's take a quick look at the protists. The protists are unicellular eukaryotes. Protists were the first eukaryotic organisms to appear on Earth. That's why I think of them as kind of the link between the prokaryotes and then the multicellular eukaryotes. And fungi, plants, and animals, they all evolved from protists. Some protists, have an organelle called the contractile vacuole. And I've noticed that it sometimes shows up in the MCAS. So these are three images from three different MCAS in which a protist, these are images of protists, with a contractile vacuole appeared. So some protists have an organelle called the contractile vacuole. Contractile vacuoles pump excess water out of the cell. These organisms, they live in fresh water. And if you remember what we were talking about with concentration gradients, because the water is fresh, there's a greater concentration of such things as salt inside of the organism. It's fresh water, not salt water. So the water diffuses, it's called osmosis, it diffuses into the cell. And so the cell starts to balloon up. And so the purpose of this contractile vacuole is actually to pump that water out. So, and another distinguishing feature of contractile vacuoles is that they're star-shaped. So if you see a star-shaped organelle in an organism on the MCAS, know that you're looking at a protist. And if it's labeled, well, obviously you're looking at a protist too. That just makes your job easier. But it wasn't actually labeled on that image on the right. Let's look at a couple possible MCAS questions. A scientist is looking at unicellular organisms under a microscope. One of the organisms has a cell wall, and the scientist observes the organism reproducing through binary fission. To which kingdom does the organism most likely belong? A. Eubacteria, B. Fungi, C. Plantae, or D. Animalia? And the answer is A. Eubacteria. Because we know that first of all, it's unicellular, it has a cell wall, and it reproduces through binary fission. Those all give it away as a prokaryote and hence as a eubacterium. Which of the following cells is most likely a protist? In A, we have a cell that has a mitochondrion. In B, we have a cell that has a central vacuole. In C, we have a cell that has a contractile vacuole. And in D, we have an organism that has DNA. Well, D is kind of ridiculous because all organisms have DNA, so that doesn't distinguish that organism from any other organism. The answer is C, contractile vacuole. Remember, some protists have a contractile vacuole because they live in fresh water. And so water diffuses into the organism and it has to pump it out. So that's a contractile vacuole, that star-shaped organelle that some protists have. This video is about the 6 kingdoms of life. And we started off by looking at some of the vocabulary we'll need in order to help categorize living things. We looked at unicellular versus multicellular organisms. We talked about how some organisms reproduce asexually, whereas others reproduce sexually. Some organisms are autotrophs, they make their own food, and other organisms are heterotrophs, they can't make their own food. And autotrophs can also be called producers, whereas heterotrophs can be called consumers. And we saw that the 6 kingdoms of life were the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria, the Protists, and the fungi, plants, and animals. We saw that Eubacteria and Archaebacteria were prokaryotic, whereas the protists, fungi, plants, and animals were eukaryotic. And I think of the protists as a link between the first organisms on Earth, which were all unicellular prokaryotes, a link between them and the multicellular eukaryotes, because the protists are the unicellular eukaryotes. And one of the organelles that distinguishes protists is the contractile vacuole. And the contractile vacuole just pumps water out of the cell, excess water.